Your Eminences, Metropolitans and Archbishops, Commander Limbarakis, conference planners, members of German civil society and government, my dear friend Cem Özdemir, former colleague at the German Marshall Fund, ambassadors, brother Archons, and other esteemed guests. It's an honor to be invited on behalf of Brookings. There are many better qualified Archons, but on behalf of Brookings to speak today in this city on this issue. Perhaps Brookings' greatest accomplishment in our 97 years has been to help design the Marshall Plan in 1947. Not only did that contribute to reviving post-war Europe, but it also followed through on President Truman's commitment to aid Greece and Turkey earlier that year. A Europe whole and free, including Greece and Turkey, remains a major priority for Brookings. And it's also a joy to return to Berlin, where I visited often when I worked at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, whose founding endowment was a gift to America from Germany in appreciation for the Marshall Plan. As we Americans like to say, what goes around comes around. Religious liberty, religious equality, and human rights, tolerance and pluralism animate this conference. I've been asked to place those ideas in a global context. Europe's relationship to Turkey, of course, on religious freedom is not just a matter between those two countries, but has global significance. So I'm going to ask you to follow me around the world. We will travel west from here, through that magnificent gate of freedom, across Europe, to America, continuing west on to Asia, and then back through the Middle East before coming finally to Turkey and to Europe again. As we travel, we will consider another concept that is central to law, foreign policy, and even to religion, and often associated with walls, fences, and borders. And it is certainly appropriate for any trip around the world that requires showing a passport, and that concept, of course, is sovereignty. All these abstract concepts are embedded in real-life history, often a history soaked in blood. Our timeless aspirations for liberty, equality, tolerance, or even sovereignty have been practiced considerably different ways over time. So as we go from place to place, I'd like to anchor my remarks in at least 4 views that sovereign states have held toward religious freedom and neutrality. The first view opposes freedom of religion with no neutrality. From secular to religious dictatorships, these states are defined by hubris, believing that government can only know the one true faith or secular ideology. These governments not only criminalize certain public actions, they also criminalize the practice of certain beliefs. Let's call this state the Leviathan. The second kind of sovereign state allows religious freedom, but advocates on behalf of one or even several different religions. All religions are allowed to function in these states, but they provide unequal support for them. This non-neutrality promotes religion, or even some religions, as providing a foundational moral role in civic life. Of course, the downside is that while one religion or denomination can be a central thread in a nation's moral fabric, control of that faith can lead a sovereign government to the conceit that it still knows the true path forward, even if it is willing to allow alternatives. Let's call this potentially conceited state the paternalist. A third sovereign state is neutral against religion. That is, it allows religion to practice freely, but that freedom is bounded in some degree. This view of neutrality is driven by fear, and that drive can be just as easily used to shut down the toleration of religious faiths. Both democracies and autocracies actually practice these tighter or looser controls on religious freedom. Let's call this fearful state the watchman. And finally, some states have actively promoted the free exercise of religion in a neutral way, but in a positive way. These states never choose a particular religion to favor, but instead understand that human knowledge is limited, and that diverse opinions about the one true God, or many gods or no God, is itself the human condition. Our striving for knowledge, especially our striving for knowledge about ultimate things, our place in the world, our primary duties, that is the source of our dignity as human beings. This view of government and religion begins with humility. Let's call this hopeful state the celebrant. The Leviathan, no freedom, no neutrality, is characterized by hubris. The paternalist, freedom but no neutrality, is characterized by conceit. The watchman, neutral but willing to limit freedom, is characterized by fear, and the celebrant, full neutrality and full freedom, is characterized by humility and hope. If it's not already obvious, like most Americans, I think I hold a bias toward the celebrant. We tend to be self-satisfied in that regard. Yogi Berra once said, when finding out that the mayor of Dublin, Ireland, was Jewish, "A Jewish mayor in Dublin, only in America." As we travel, I think you will see it is important to be realistic as well. In the real world of public affairs, hope is not a strategy. So we start our journey in Europe, where all four views of liberty and sovereignty have lived. That is appropriate. Sovereignty, after all, was invented in Europe. In fact, sovereignty as a concept came before any ideas of religious freedom. It's a concept that came from the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, which, as the joke goes, after 1,000 years became neither holy, neither Roman, nor an empire. As kings across Europe struggled with Rome and tried to separate themselves, they used the word sovereignty as a way to make themselves godlike. Writers such as Jean Bodin and Thomas Hobbes patterned the king's power on their perception of God, absolute, unified, and eternal. Hobbes' great book, of course, was called The Leviathan. The seldom-read second half of that book argued that the sovereign needed to control religious affairs, to keep domestic peace among rival religious factions. European kings went on to fight a series of wars with one another, where one hubristic, godlike warrior took on another on the field of battle. The failure of these religious wars ended in 1648 at the Great Peace Conference in Westphalia. Sovereign monarchs recognized one another as equal, separate, and responsible for morality and religion within their realms. Each monarch was allowed to choose the church for his people. Catholic kings paid obedience to Rome. Protestant kings set their own rules. Yet with so many warring kings claiming to have God on their side, even a deeply religious thinker such as John Locke worried about conjoining religion to politics. Locke felt that no human authority could copy the sovereign power of God. Locke is, of course, most famous for arguing that if power did not come from God, it should come only from the consent of the public. And as a result, he's considered the father of popular sovereignty. But yet Locke himself would have never used that phrase. He would have thought it an oxymoron, since the people could no more assume God's power than a king. In other words, for Locke, the people could govern themselves, but they could not collectively impose beliefs on any single person. Thanks to Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers, many sovereigns began to allow pluralism within their borders. Most of these were paternalists, that is, still promoting a top-down religion within their state, but allowing for some dissenting views. Still, twice in 300 years, hubris tore through Europe. First was Napoleon's march across the continent in the early 1800s, political hubris of the First Order. His one saving grace from the perspective of religious freedom was that he believed that the state should be neutral toward religion. That is, he combined a continent-wide Leviathan in political affairs with the watchman's view of religious affairs. Religion could be tolerated as long as it did not undermine public order. 150 years after Napoleon came the next horror of hubris: fascist totalitarianism in Germany and Italy, and communist totalitarianism in Russia. While nominally these states allowed some Christian denominations to continue, by and large they opposed and oppressed religion. They were atheistic leviathans of the most vicious, murderous kind. So I've condensed 4 centuries of European war into about 4 minutes. Let's just remember 2 things. First, Western Europe has fallen out of love with sovereignty. The European Union that has emerged is the world's most successful experiment in transcending the sovereign nation state. The EU realizes at some level that giving unitary, absolute, and eternal power to any earthly authority is dangerous at best and lethal at worst. The European Convention on Human Rights follows from that fear, protecting all citizens of Europe from any effort to control thought, conscience, or religion. But second, many, not all, but many Europeans fear religion. Freedoms of thought, conscience, and religion may be, and I'm quoting from the European Charter, prescribed by law in the interests of public safety for the protection of public order, health, or morals, or for the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. That is, Europe's neutrality toward religion means that freedom always contains some potential limit. Europe's member countries vary, of course, on this. France is more of a watchman. England, Greece, and Italy have a closer relationship with an officially sanctioned church than has France, so they are more paternalistic. But in general terms, over the last 4 centuries, Europe has moved from hubris to the mildest forms of fear and conceit. From Europe, let's now continue to travel west across the Atlantic, following the path of colonists escaping religious persecution and religious wars over 400 years ago. The first colonists in the early 1600s sought religious freedom, yet while they celebrated their first Thanksgiving with animist native tribes, the colonies founded by pilgrims were not necessarily neutral, quite the contrary. Various colonies each had their own distinct denominational charter and character: separatists, Puritans, and Congregationalists in Massachusetts, Anglicans in Virginia, Catholics in Maryland and Delaware, Quakers in Pennsylvania. Eventually, American thinkers picked up on John Locke, not just on his ideas about public consent for government, but also on religious freedom. Thomas Jefferson led this effort. Several months before authoring the Declaration of Independence, he also drafted a statute for religious liberty in Virginia. A document so important to him, he listed it on his gravestone as one of his 3 great lifetime accomplishments, along with the Declaration and founding the University of Virginia. Interestingly enough, he didn't list being President of the United States in that category. Jefferson, a thinker and leader inspired by the Enlightenment, wrote in the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom with precision on the limits of human intelligence. He called all political, civic, and ecclesiastic leaders but fallible and uninspired men, himself included. Clearly, he had not met the clergy assembled here with us today. Still, even with this fallibility, he saw it as the Lord's plan to empower the mind. Quote, who being Lord, both of body and mind, chose not to propagate by coercion on either. Jefferson attacked not just suppression of religious freedom, but also state support of religion. State support only tended to, quote, beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness. Rather than simply guaranteeing freedom, Jefferson argued for full neutrality. The state of Virginia should not establish an official religion, since no man should be compelled to financially support, quote, the propagation of opinions with which he disbelieves. That became the foundation for the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution 15 years later, that says that Congress, quote, shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Jefferson was not just playing watchman, however, he was celebrating religious diversity. Religious instruction and education was part of Jefferson's design for the University of Virginia, and that included studying not just various Christian denominations, but also the core tenets of Judaism and Islam. Recently, America's first elected Islamic member of Congress was sworn in on Thomas Jefferson's copy of the Quran. Of course, there is still a roiling debate in the US between whether government should be neutral against religion or provide equal support for all religions. One new book suggests that historically the US has favored a version of neutrality that Jefferson would have applauded, one that has neutrally encouraged citizens to worship because that leads to a more rich, diverse, inclusive, and morally informed society. My dear friend at the Hoover Institution, Peter Berkowitz, has effectively argued this makes neither atheists nor moralists happy. Atheists argue for a more strict version of neutrality, which fears any connection at all between religion and public life. Moralists, on the other hand, would like the state to encourage a more active role for non-denominational celebrations of religion. What I think Jefferson had in mind was more like a mosaic of the religiously minded, a spirit that animates many of the great acts of American democracy. Morally engaged religious believers played a crucial role in key struggles for freedom. In the mid-19th century to end slavery, in the mid-20th century to secure civil rights for blacks, today in fighting against poverty and protecting the environment. Of course, there is a very dark side to this story in America. Many Southerners for centuries used religious beliefs to justify slavery, the slaughter of Native Americans, the oppression of women and other immigrants, and even to promote racial eugenics. As a principle, celebratory neutrality is fine, but by not introducing boundaries for religious practice when it starts to go into public life, the Jeffersonian approach appears to allow all manner of perversity in the name of piety. including hostility towards other faiths. Indeed, perversity often remains the price of freedom in both the US and in EU in recent years. When it comes to respect, for instance, for Islamic minorities, public celebrations of diversity have not met our highest aspirations. Whether that is an effort by Christian ministers to burn the Quran or opportunistic political entrepreneurs to oppose Muslim places of worship, our citizens have tended to act out of fear or conceit, as opposed to acting out of hope or humility. Even our formal laws from time to time have moved in that direction, whether it is the banning of the wearing of headscarves, the building of mosques, the providing of Islamic education. We have not had the courage to embrace our brethren who see God differently than we do. If we are to demand that around the world, we must demand it in our own countries. How we draw that line between celebrating diversity of belief and limiting intolerant acts is the hard and dirty works of public life. So having gotten our hands dirty in America, let's continue to travel west until we eventually reach the Far East. If we are going to discuss universal concepts, we must fully address the 1 in 3 humans today who live in China and India. Our Euro-Atlantic view of the world, the US, EU, the rest of North and South America, that entire landmass has 1.3 billion people. That is roughly the same population as either India or China alone. So when my family and I took our journey to China last year, we experienced the reality of constrained religious worship firsthand in China. For Easter services, we had 3 options: the Russian Embassy's Orthodox Church, inside the compound requiring approval from the Russian government, a Chinese language Catholic church, whose bishop is approved by Beijing authorities, or at a local independent Anglican service, which operated in the dining hall of a residence for foreign nationals. We chose the latter for convenience and ease of access, but we had to bring our passports. These services were forbidden for Chinese citizens. Still, wandering around China, we saw signs of religion everywhere. A giant Buddhist temple overlooks Beijing at the high point in the city, the capital of the world's largest country with an atheist ideology. Buddhist and Taoist temples, churches, and mosques can be found all across China. Hundreds of millions of Chinese practice Buddhism and Taoism, and as many as 100 million Christians, and between 20 million and 50 million Muslims. Many worship in registered patriotic religious associations, that is, state-recognized religious bodies. But thousands of home churches and temples across the country do not choose to register. Probably about 1/3 of China worships some deity, 3 times as many as the 80 million members of the Communist Party. As with Napoleon, China's government is part Leviathan, part watchman. The current government of Xi Jinping is just as focused and obsessed with maintaining national sovereignty and unity as were its predecessors. When Mao Zedong's Communist Party consolidated power, fear was his dominant motivation for strictly limiting both freedom of religion as well as pluralism. Mao feared religion was a front for former colonial powers to regain influence. He also feared Buddhism, Islam, and Taoism. During the Cultural Revolution, Mao's fear was married with a Marxist hubris, leading to one of the greatest religious suppressions in human history. After 1978, his successor, Deng Xiaoping, began to liberalize Chinese politics, including religion. He allowed private worship. Still, fear is one of the current Chinese government's approach. Fear is central to the current Chinese government's approach. In Western China, for instance, the heavy hand of the central government regularly confronts violent riots by Turkic Uyghur Muslims, and the self-immolations by Tibetan Buddhist monks and riots by average Tibetan citizens are commonplace in China. On the other side of the Himalayas, the world's other giant nation, India, has 1.2 billion people. If you think China does not have enough religious observance, go to India. In fact, some in India complain that there are too many gods. North India is the birthplace of at least 4 religions, Hinduism still the largest with 4 out of 5 Indians practicing, as well as Buddhism, Sikhism, and Jainism. South India has been home to Christianity and Islam since the early days of both faiths. St. Thomas settled and died there in the decades following Christ's crucifixion. Early Islamic traders also traveled extensively on the southern and western coasts, followed by the Portuguese, Spanish, and British traders and missionaries. And of course, the Turkic Mughal emperors ruled across North India for 5 centuries. The Taj Mahal was built by one, started before the first Thanksgiving in America, and ended after European kings concluded peace at Westphalia. Religious pluralism generally has worked well in modern India, and that's mostly thanks to the nation's modern founding father, Mahatma Gandhi, who was the ultimate celebrant. Gandhi saw his religion, Hinduism, as the nonviolent search for truth. In his words, the need of the moment is not one religion, but mutual respect and tolerance of the devotees of the different religions of the world. The soul of religion is one, but it is encased in a multitude of forms. Truth is the exclusive property of no single scriptures. Because of Gandhi, tolerance for religious minorities is woven into the fabric of India's national government. Not just through words, but also through his nonviolent deeds, Gandhi has much to teach us all. He was a central inspiration, for instance, for Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders in America. But at the sub-national level, historical tensions and resentments run deep. The fear of communalism remains strong. Local governments often have a hard time restraining themselves or their people. India will wrestle with those forces in the coming year. In national elections in 2014, the opposition Hindu Nationalist Party will be led by Narendra Modi, arguably India's most popular politician. But he is also the most widely feared. Hindu-Muslim riots stormed his home state of Gujarat in 2002, killing nearly 1,000 Muslims. Many still blame Modi for failing to stop the violence, and as a result, the United States still does not issue him a visa, thanks to a provision in US law that bars any foreign government official who, quote, directly carries out at any time particularly severe violations of religious freedom. Both India and China are protective of their sovereignty. Nevertheless, as I think we can see, both Muslims and Christians around the world share an interest in protecting the rights of minorities in those two massive countries. But what we do in our countries toward our own minorities, Christian and Muslim included, will set critical precedents for how they treat our brethren. Continuing west from India, we enter the broader Middle East. The Arab awakenings started there as secular revolutions against failed economics and political oppression by largely military rulers. But these democratic uprisings have also unleashed fundamentalist forces, raising new questions about religious liberty. Whether it is the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, extremists in the Free Syrian Army, or the continuing reign of the Ayatollahs in Iran, the religious persecution of Christian, Jews, and all manner of other Muslim sects remains a major challenge to hopeful Jeffersonians or Gandhians. In today's Arab world, many wonder whether a strategy of hope is even realistic. Of course, the most effective and established democracy in the region, and the West's closest ally, is still Israel. A country born out of religious persecution, it is the region's model for toleration and restraint. But even here, freedom of religion is far from neutral. Ahmad Tibi embodies the mixed message of Israel. He is an elected Arab representative in a Jewish and democratic state. In his words, Israel is a democracy for Jews and a Jewish state for Arabs. Right or wrong, Mr. Tibi argues that the Arab citizens of Israel, not even the occupied territory, 1/5 of the country's population, do not share in equality of religious treatment. With that, our circuitous route around the world brings us back to Turkey, a land and a people very dear to me. My paternal grandfather and maternal great-grandparents were born there. My grandfather served in the Ottoman army in World War I, and as a child, I still recall him showing off his fez and his hookah pipe, and boasting that Greeks from Turkey played tavli better than Greeks from Greece. Kemal Ataturk's views on sovereignty and secularism are the starting place for any discussion on the topic in Turkey. He hoped to build an independent state that would divorce secular sovereign power from traditional religious leaders. In that sense, he combined an Enlightenment instinct for Turkey as the home of a modern nation with a view that the state should be strong enough to withstand foreign intervention. Ataturk did see a paternalistic role for Islam. Limited and moderate religious instruction could provide a common moral foundation for a country populated not only with Anatolian Turks, but also with refugees from Bosnia, Hungary, Bulgaria, the Tartars, Albania, and across the former Ottoman Empire. But he intentionally avoided the fascism of later Italy and Germany, as well as the communist totalitarianism of Russia. His reform of primary education, including stripping out religious dogma. Religious minorities were formally protected, but they clearly have taken a second-class citizenship status since, which in many ways was a step backward from the protection they had received under the Ottoman Caliphate. 75 years after Ataturk's death, the treatment of minorities has been anything but exemplary. Christian and Jewish populations have declined dramatically, and the government has directly intervened in how those communities conduct their public and private affairs, including choosing their own leaders and educating their children and their clergy. The question remains for how confident Erdogan's Turkey is in its own identity. Certainly, Turkey's recent decision to follow findings by Europe's Human Rights Court on minority religious properties was a major step forward. Indeed, it is hard to imagine another sovereign nation outside Europe agreeing to change its domestic laws in reaction to the EU's Human Rights Court. If Turkey continues to take steps in line with other democratic governments, such as allowing full religious instruction to minorities or allowing these organizations to pick their own leaders, it will continue to distinguish itself from the Chinas, Irans, and repressive states within India that exist. Prime Minister Erdogan also speaks the language of paternalism, which he describes when he describes the AKP as the Islamic analog to Germany's Christian Democrats. Whether Erdogan's Turkey is willing to similarly embrace other religious minorities in the way Christian Democrats, however, remains an unanswered question. Just this October, as our German and Turkish participants surely know, the Christian Democrats elected their first ever Muslim member of parliament, Camille Giossuf. Ms. Giossuf believes it is not just possible for non-Christian Germans to believe in low taxes and a role for religious instruction in schools. The Christian Democrats have a Muslim, only in America. So the question for Erdogan's Turkey is whether it sees for itself a vision that begins to get beyond fear and conceit. Does it see itself as a place capable of celebrating diversity? Recent protests in Turkey, which brought together religious and secular communities, suggest that the Turkish people themselves may have moved towards a more diverse, tolerant, and democratic society. Will Mr. Erdogan's government follow? That challenge is equally great for Europe, whether it can also see that society without fear. Europe is only now beginning to emerge from an economic crisis that threatened the EU's very basic existence. With the EU focused on its internal financial challenges, it should be little surprise that discussions are on hold about whether to welcome new entrants, such as Turkey. Yet if that conversation begins again, which I believe it will, the question of whether Turkey belongs in the EU will pivot not only on whether Turkey sees itself as a tolerant European nation, but also how broadly Europe defines its own tolerance. This conversation did not begin very well. In 2002, the chairman of Europe's Constitutional Convention, Giscard d'Estaing, famously said that Turkey had a different culture, a different approach, a different way of life. In my view, disregarding the extraordinary distance Turkey has traveled when compared with neighbors in a very troubled region. Yet recently, Giscard and the Christian Democrats here in Germany have expressed an openness to reviving that conversation. Tearing down the wall between Europe and Turkey will require setting aside not just hubris on both sides, but also conceit and fear. Tearing down walls is a metaphor for embracing hope and diversity. And on both sides, that begins with respect. Thank you very much.